Get ready, fight!
Hey, what you playing?
Dead or Alive. It's like a martial arts fighting game.
A fighting game, huh?
Alright, listen, you picked the worst possible moment to walk in. I've been playing fighting games for well over 20 years now, and while I do enjoy the more popular series in the genre, like Tekken and Street Fighter, I've always had a soft spot for the Dead or Alive series. Ever the underdog, the Dead or Alive games still had a lot going for them. They were usually the first fighting games released for new Xbox consoles, that's how I got into them initially. Fast-paced but approachable combat, flashy multi-tiered stages, and over-the-top design philosophy, banging soundtracks, industry-leading graphics, and cutting-edge physics. Sorry, got distracted there. One Reddit user tried to sum it up here. Dead or Alive's story is like an action movie set in the Ninja Gaiden universe. It consistently has the best graphics and animations of any fighter. The gameplay is super fast, and this is a little long-winded. Let's see if we can find a more concise summary. Great gameplay and great tits. Honestly, yeah, that's not too far off. Dead or Alive rules, but the series remained a bit niche as it gained a bit of a stigma that eventually led to an identity crisis, one that ultimately may have ended the franchise. Today I'd like to take a little trip down memory lane and revisit every mainline, numbered entry in the Dead or Alive series together. Much like Final Fantasy was for Square, the Dead or Alive series first jiggled onto the scene as a do-or-die high-stakes investment for developer Tecmo, hence the name, that found success and ultimately went on to produce 6 mainline titles and several interesting spin-offs, evolving substantially with each iteration before ultimately meeting its now possible demise at the hands of corporate greed. Let's explore the Dead or Alive legacy of cutting-edge graphics, incredibly fun and unique game mechanics, and gratuitous fan service. Quick disclaimer, this is just a general overview of the series' evolution over the years for fun, not a technical analysis of gameplay mechanics or systems. I wear too much deodorant to be affiliated with the competitive fighting game scene. I am just a casual player, not an expert. Thank you. Also, just a quick note, I'll be comparing the ultimate or best version of each entry here, partially to play each iterative entry in its final form, but mostly because those are just the versions that I happen to own already. First, let's take a look at the game that started it all, Dead or Alive 1. Born of a desire to replicate Virtua Fighter's 3D fighting, Dead or Alive found a recipe to 90s arcade success by combining it with the fan service elements found in other franchises like Street Fighter and King of Fighters. While the series would, to some extent, forever live in the shadow of bigger names, it stood firm on its own merit through polished gameplay, stage, and character design. The core of the gameplay focused heavily on counterattacking, starting in the first game, but continuing on through the series, and this first entry introduced the series staple hold system, a rock-paper-scissors triangle of counters, replacing the traditional guard system found in most other fighters at the time. The inherent guesswork for a novice player was not the favorite of some, but skilled players were certainly able to learn patterns and utilize the counter system effectively. The presence of the counter mechanic could make it difficult at times to chain combos and introduced a nice little layer of risk and reward to the combat. The first game was also, of course, our first look at the story of Dead or Alive, which is a crazy intersection of ninja clans, revenge plots, and evil scientific corporations, where all problems are to be solved and all goals achieved in a martial arts tournament through violence, naturally. It's a lot of fun, and honestly way deeper than it needed to be in a fighting game, if you do care to follow along. Right out of the gate, Dead or Alive made a bold statement with its design. As per creator Tomonobu Itagaki, every good game needs 2 things: violence and sexuality. Hell yeah, brother. This first entry also featured interactive stage design with its explosive danger zones, as well as the physics that became a part of the game's legacy. Betraying that legacy would come back to haunt them in the final game of the series, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Dead or Alive 1 was a critical and financial success, and it saved the company. resulting in many subsequent ports to consoles like the Sega Saturn, PlayStation 1, and later on an enhanced version, the one I'm showing here, released on Xbox, and due to its success, spawned a sequel in short order. I did enjoy my time with this first game, and I think for a first release, it did achieve the stated objectives, but revisiting it in 2025 left a lot to be desired. The combat felt a bit stiff, slower than I remember Dead or Alive games feeling. Combos feel clunky, and there's a lack of depth to both the gameplay and the character roster, but if memory serves correctly, all these problems are about to be solved. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this so far, please let me know in the comments below, and consider hitting both the like and hype buttons. This video took a long time to make, and any engagement helps to make sure people see it. Thanks, now let's get right back into it. Dead or Alive 2 is one of the most impressive sequels that I can think of. This entry, and one other that we'll get to a bit later on the list, are correctly cited as being the best in the franchise. It didn't start out that way, as the initial release of the game was rushed, but the revised version of the game on PS2, called Dead or Alive 2 Hardcore, reached a peak so high that, in my opinion, the series would struggle to ever reach again. The Ultimate version, remade on Xbox that you're seeing here, came later, and brought in elements from Dead or Alive 3, like improved visuals and additional costumes, stages, and the ability to unlock Hitomi as a playable character. Dead or Alive 2 offered drastically improved graphics and animations, built in a new engine, faster and more fluid controls, and a bigger roster with more costumes than the first game. This first sequel was also the introduction of the little cinematic cutscenes for each character, the first instance of interactive, multi-tiered stages with cinematic transitions, a series staple moving forward, and it also introduced Tag Mode, a fan favorite and beloved game mode that I'm sure Team Ninja would never be foolish enough to omit from future entries. Dead or Alive 2 was a joy to play and felt so much more like the Dead or Alive that I remember. It was snappy and responsive, and the clunkiness in combat was all but eliminated. It really highlighted the eccentric spirit of the series creator, perpetually wearing his sunglasses indoors to protect his vision of sexuality and violence. Dead or Alive 2 delivered so much in one package, arguably most of the things people like about the game started here, and it executed it all so well that the growing fan base was now eagerly awaiting the next entry to see what Team Ninja would cook up next. Dead or Alive 3 served as the entry point into the franchise for a lot of players. The series had gained some traction, and this new entry, a launch title for the original Xbox, promised and delivered a next-gen fighter that would trump anything available on other hardware. The gambit paid off yet again, as Dead or Alive 3 was, and likely still is, the best-selling title in the entire franchise, selling over 2 million copies. And this really is a phenomenal-looking original Xbox game. This is likely one of the best-looking games on the entire console, despite being a launch title. And considering the hardware limitations of the Xbox, it's seriously impressive to have achieved that right out of the gate. Team Ninja also improved on combat yet again in this entry, increasing the speed of gameplay as well as expanding on character movesets. This added depth, combined with the increased pacing, felt like it gently turned the dial up on the game feel relative to the already solid second entry, and it was a welcome change. It also brought a few new things to the table, such as an improved story mode with better writing and CG cutscenes at the end of the story for each character, unrestricted 3D axis movement. Basically, it allowed players to move more freely in 3D space, which let you be more precise and strategic with your positioning in the now larger multi-tiered arenas, and a new command training mode called Sparring Mode that gave beginners better tools to learn the game. That said, and I don't want to be too critical here, but this felt like a relatively safe entry to me. That's not necessarily a knock against the game, mind you. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But after the cataclysmic delivery of so many iconic features and the graphical overhaul in the Ultimate Edition of the second title, this third entry felt maybe a little flat by comparison. Revisiting these in 2025, and with the power of hindsight, Dead or Alive 3 looks and plays somewhat similarly to Dead or Alive 2 Ultimate. It's no surprise, since that game was a remake that brought in the look and gameplay feel of Dead or Alive 3, but did it to what most consider to be an objectively better game. and I have to agree. I thought Dead or Alive 3 was fun. It was nice to see the series continue to make minor improvements to key components, such as graphical fidelity and game feel, but at the end of my time with it, my opinion ended up being simply, this is fine. It wasn't overly exciting as a sequel, but it didn't need to be either, and I'll always prefer a sequel that focuses on iterating on all the things that the previous entries did right, instead of making some sort of sudden left turn and abandoning a winning formula and their established fan base. Sorry, I'll stop with the foreshadowing joke now. Alright, let's address the elephant in the room. We've now reached the point in the series' history where the notorious first Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball game was released on Xbox. While nearly every fighting game series featured some degree of spicy fan service, this was where Team Ninja really leaned into it as their thing, and every subsequent game featured a mature rating as a result. It's hard to say if this was inherently a bad move. Moving forward, we'd now see a new Extreme game in between every mainline entry, so it must have been selling well, and it was abundantly clear from the beginning that sexuality was part of the vision. That said, this era represented a shift in both tone and perception of the series, viewed now by many to be primarily a fan service title, rather than a real fighting game to be taken seriously. Now, I don't know how to record my 3DS, but I did want to throw a special mention to Dead or Alive Dimensions. It's got excellent gameplay and game modes. It's a nice recap of the story up to this point, and it's got a huge roster. Functionally, it's a celebration of the entire series up to this point in time, and it's a nice cap on what I view now as the retro era of the series. Definitely play Dead or Alive Dimensions if you have the ability on a 3DS. Dead or Alive 4 is an interesting one. It has incredible graphics, a huge leap yet again moving to the Xbox 360. As far as I could tell, this was the first major fighting game release on that console, even after a slightly delayed release, pushing it back from the original plan of being a launch title. Dead or Alive 4 was emblematic of the tonal shift mentioned earlier. The story became less dark and serious, worse overall in my opinion, opting instead for a more playful spirit with a significantly heavier focus on fan service. Given that this was also the first mature-rated entry in the series, they were able to freely explore the more risque visual elements, much to the delight of the Goon Squad fanbase that was increasingly becoming their target audience, but at the cost of increasing stigma around the franchise's name as not being a real or serious fighting game. Gameplay honestly felt mostly unchanged, choosing to stick with what worked mechanically and expand instead on the content available, a solid choice, I'd argue. This title was, however, notoriously difficult, the hardest in the series, and it's not particularly close. There was no easy mode, counter windows are way tighter, and the opponent AI seems noticeably unfair at times, especially the final boss, who is beyond ridiculous. The series' staple of elaborate, almost wacky stage design stands out more here with the improved next-gen hardware, with dance clubs and jungles full of dinosaurs really coming to life. Dead or Alive 4 is a great-looking game that sticks to the formula that's been working for the series in terms of gameplay, but lost some of its luster for me as a casual player due to the balancing issues in single-player modes and what felt like a downgrade in quality on the story. I appreciated the improved graphical fidelity, additional content like more costumes and stages, and the increasingly robust roster, but not enough to prefer this entry over the previous two games, simply due to the frustrations I experienced while playing it. It's fun, but I think they should have allocated a bit more of the focus they placed on the TNA over to gameplay balance and writing a better story and character endings instead. This really felt like a low point in the series after playing the last three games. It almost felt incomplete, a noticeable drop in quality from what I would expect after the consistency in the first two sequels. After Dead or Alive 4, the series was shelved for a bit, and it would be an agonizing 7 years before we saw another mainline title dropped in the series. Control of the series had changed hands by that point, and we were coming off arguably the worst Dead or Alive game since the original, at least in my opinion. My expectations for the Dead or Alive 5 release were admittedly pretty low to start with, and I saw the DLC page on Steam bearing a bad omen for things to come.
Just when I think you couldn't possibly be any dumber, you go and do something like this. And totally redeem yourself!
Oh yeah, baby. Just kidding. Dead or Alive 5 is frickin' awesome, man. Talk about a return to form. This game is in contention with Dead or Alive 2 for the best in the series. And again, I'm playing the final release of the game. This is Dead or Alive 5 Last Round, which was the final release with the most content. Dead or Alive 5 has stunning graphics. Team Ninja was always ahead of the curve enough that this game still holds its own against modern titles over a decade after its release. They did opt to almost reboot the appearance of the franchise in this fifth entry, offering a substantial artistic change from the almost anime-inspired 3D characters of the past to a more realistic aesthetic, and it works for me. I like it a lot because they really took the time to polish it, and they respected the established character designs in the process. Sound design also saw a nice bump in quality, offering far more impactful, tactile sound effects than we'd seen in any of the previous titles. Gameplay saw some nice new additions as well, the first major changes since Dead or Alive 2. This sequel introduced critical bursts, a mechanic where you basically stun your opponent through combos, CCing them temporarily and setting you up for a critical burst move for major damage. It also introduced power blows and power launchers, which was functionally just the introduction of super moves or ultimate abilities to the series. Sum these flashy new mechanics with the already established, over-the-top cinematic nature of the franchise, and you've added a very welcome splash of color and depth to an already beautiful presentation. And it was sorely needed by this point, because we hadn't really seen any significant changes to the combat since 1999's Dead or Alive 2 release. Staying on theme here, the story mode also saw major changes, moving away from what was functionally an arcade mode with a few set rival fights now to a fully linear, cinematic storyline. The story is, admittedly, somewhat medium quality. I mean, it's a fighting game, and we still need to find reasons to shove all these characters into yet another fighting tournament, but I liked this new direction of moving on to something that feels like a fully fleshed out story mode instead of an arcade mode with a few incidental plot points jammed in, and it did feel like this game's story did an okay job of honoring previous character interactions and storylines. The tone is also a bit more serious again when it needs to be, another welcome return to form. And as I stated, Dead or Alive 5 Last Round is also the most content-heavy entry in the series thus far, bringing back every previous game mode to date, plus a better fighting tutorial to get beginners up to speed, and a full song list from the entire franchise. Dead or Alive 5 feels like a game made for the fans, a title that fully embraced everything that made the series successful to begin with. It polished the fast-paced game mechanics, added all the beloved game modes back in, packed the game with content and a better story mode, and gave us a giant roster of nearly 40 characters to enjoy it with. It improved on the graphics in a major way, and it didn't shy away from the fanservice elements that fans had come to expect. This was the biggest shakeup to the formula since Dead or Alive 2, and perhaps the best entry in the series thus far. There was just one glaring negative thing that stands out to me, a dark omen of sorts of things to come. The game did have some fairly infamous microtransactions, primarily costume DLC. A lot of it, obscene amounts of it, over $1,000 of season pass costumes to pay and grind for. At least one playable character is now discontinued, and most of the costumes are now exclusively available in expensive bundles. There is, mind you, a healthy amount of content to unlock simply by playing the game, but the nature of season passes is still kind of shitty, and the game does like to shove what you're missing out on in your face a little bit. While this is a bit unsavory, and it was an eye-rolling sight to see new DLC outfits and IP crossovers coming out for Dead or Alive 5 all the time, I still think that's a minor, entirely cosmetic blemish, on what is otherwise the best game in the series to date and the peak of the entire franchise. I can't wait to see what they do next! Fast forward 7 years, again, and Koei Tecmo's greed would really shine as we moved into the final entry on today's list, and perhaps ever in the series. Alright, let's talk about Dead or Alive 6. We've spent the majority of this video talking about Dead or Alive's legacy being rooted in sexuality and violence, a series that started out with humble roots, emulating the success of other franchises, before finding its own lane as a wacky, over-the-top fighting game that prides itself in embracing those core themes from which it was born. Dead or Alive found its success, at least in part, by leaning into that campy style and excessive fan service. It was in some ways an alternative to the more mainstream competitive fighting game titles like Street Fighter, with more mature themes leaning into the sexuality component in much the same way that Mortal Kombat had leaned into the violence. In their great and infinite wisdom, somewhere between Koei Tecmo and Team Ninja, a decision was made to abandon this legacy as the priority and tone down the base character model's fan service for competitive play so they could try and break into the esports scene to compete with other fighting franchises. Which rubbed the Gooners the wrong way this time. Now, if you recall, they were still releasing Dead or Alive Extreme games and scandalous costume DLC all the way through the previous game's lifecycle. They sowed these sultry seeds, they cultivated this fanbase and their expectations, and then they spit in the face of their core audience. It's not that Dead or Alive didn't have a competitive scene, but they themselves had steered this franchise in a direction that did not lend itself to competitive play as easily. The core themes of sex and violence that the franchise was built on are the first two things to ever be censored in media. The series' stigma and reputation were kinda set in stone to some degree, and the esports players wouldn't be abandoning the likes of Tekken, Street Fighter, and Mortal Kombat anytime soon to jump into the bouncing booby fighter they had been conditioned over decades to not take as seriously. Not only that, they tried to gate all fan service behind DLC paywalls to ensure it wouldn't show up in tournament play, and included complicated and convoluted grinding methods to randomly unlock costume parts, obviously incentivizing you to spend lots of money to get the costumes you actually want. They even charged you money to change your character's hair color at one point, which they had to run back due to outrage. Team Ninja cut beloved features like tag mode and sliced the quality of the story down to an awkward mess. They added controversial new mechanics that many didn't like, such as break holds that functioned as a free counter to get out of anything, diluting the technicality of the game's defensive systems. Not only that, but they replaced the critical burst, and power launches from the previous titles with the new mechanic, a step backward in gameplay. Essentially, they spit on their core fanbase while attempting to market to the competitive scene that wasn't interested, all while cutting out some of the most appreciated features of the previous successful title. They locked the eye candy behind a paywall to avoid scandalizing the competitive scene that ultimately never really ended up adopting the game in a meaningful way anyway. As a result, compared to the 12 million downloads reported for Dead or Alive 5, yes, that does include the core free version, the sixth entry would return just 1/6 of that number, and Team Ninja pulled the plug on support entirely after less than a year. Now, it's not all bad. The graphics may be the best ever in a fighting game, and the performance is solid, and it's easy to see what could have been here. After the recent success of games like Stellar Blade, it's not hard to imagine what a truly modern Dead or Alive entry with high-quality assets could have achieved if they just stayed in their niche lane and made another game for the players. A content-rich sequel that retained all of the fan-favorite game modes, improved the story experience, and doubled down on all of the core themes that made the franchise a success to begin with. They tried to break into the esports world, to be taken more seriously. They tried to clean things up and to make a game that was safe for everyone. But as we all know, when you try to appeal to everyone, too often you end up appealing to no one in the end. Dead or Alive 6 is a sad story of what could have been, and for the foreseeable future, this franchise will remain on ice. Hopefully someday, soon, a new champion will rise up over at Team Ninja. A new generation's hero of culture, donning sunglasses, a katana, and a renewed passion for sex and violence. Until then, honestly, just play Dead or Alive 5. It's pretty sick, man. For those still around, I appreciate you sticking through to the end of the video. If you're into older games, check out this Xbox 360 video I did, or this playlist of my other game reviews, and I thank you for stopping by.